So when we fence a road, we do that to keep animals off the highway. And yes, there's also crossing structures for reasons that we talked about before. But we have to end a fence at some point. And where we have a fence end, that is where animals can enter the fenced road corridor. And if they do so, they can suppress the effectiveness of the fence in reducing collisions. The same is true for access roads. If access roads to the main road, there's a gap in the fence. And if animals enter the fenced road corridor there, then run a risk of being hit by traffic and coming out with low statistics, low effectiveness of the fence in reducing collisions. So what do we typically do when we have these access roads and sometimes also at fence ends? We put wildlife guards in, similar to cattle guards. This graph is a summary of a couple of publications. On the left-hand side of the graph, you see ungulate species. The right-hand side, you see species with paws, including bears. And on the vertical axis, you see the permeability of wildlife guards, in this case, a particular design just north of Missoula in Montana. So what you see is that there's low permeability for the ungulate species, white-tailed deer and mule deer. This is good. The deer don't or barely enter the fenced right-of-way when they have to cross these wildlife guards. But when you look at species with paws, including black bear, there is not really a substantial barrier effect. The permeability is high. These animals readily enter the fenced right-of-way across these wildlife guards. So we need to do better for species with paws. This is a simple table where on the left-hand side, the vertical axis has traffic volume ranging from low to medium to high, and on the horizontal axis, traffic speed. And here are some images of study sites that were part of the pooled fund study. And what I was trying to do is have a range of different measures, electrified barriers, that help us keep species with paws out of a fenced road corridor. Now, if you have a high volume, high speed road, you may be willing and able to spend substantial dollar amounts. If you have low volume roads, low speed, well, there may be so many of them that it wouldn't be viable if you have to spend a high dollar amount at each of these locations. And because there's so many of them, and each one of these locations is a potential weak spot in your mitigation plan, meaning openings in the fence, we need to have pretty good solutions for those low volume, low speed access points. And I'll illustrate how common these access points are. Again, this is on the Flathead Indian Reservation, not too far north of Missoula. And I circled in red these access points to agricultural fields, dispersed houses, farms. You can barely go a few hundred yards before you have another access road, especially in these multifunctional landscapes. Of course, the story is different if you have a national park or a protected area where you do not have people living there, where you may not have agricultural fields. But that is not what most of our world looks like today. Most of our world is a multifunctional landscape with villages, dispersed houses, and a lot of agriculture. So what we're aiming for is to have relatively low-cost electrified barriers that are not only a barrier for ungulates, but also for species with paws that may not cost $100,000 or more, but perhaps a few $1,000s, maybe $10,000. It would be a substantial reduction in cost and an increase in the likelihood that we can apply these effective mitigation measures in the field. Now, this is where the melon farm comes in. And the melon farm as such is not a road, but it is a huge attractant to black bears. This melon farm is just south of the Bison Range, next to Ravalli. We will visit this area tomorrow. And the farmer has seen up to 7 black bears at the same time eating melons in this field. And when we started the study, Sam was in the image here, we found melons clearly eaten by bears. You can see the teeth marks, and there's bear poop, there's bear prints. And it's true, the bears munching those melons, huge attractant. So what was done here by an NGO, People and Carnivores, partially subsidized also by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because this is an area where we have grizzly bear, is to put an electric fence around it. But the farmer needs to access this field with equipment, vehicles, workers, and there's 4 access points marked in yellow on this map. And this is where the transportation ecology comes in. We basically equipped electrified barriers, installed electrified barriers at these 4 access points, and evaluated how well they worked in keeping the black bears out of the melon patch, which is a huge attractant, and I would argue a much bigger attractant than a right-of-way would ever be, even when you have clover or dandelions in them. Now, what did the fence look like? It is a very simple, inexpensive fence. It is not designed to keep ungulates out. It is designed to keep bears out, black bear, and should they be around, grizzly bear. There's 4 access points, and we had different electrified barriers. On the upper left, it is a swing gate with electrified wires attached to it. Now, the downside of this is that you have to get in and out your vehicle every time you pass through. So these swing gates, when you apply them on, low volume access points, really you have to have a very responsible landowner to consistently close the gate whenever they go through. Or if anyone else goes through it, well, you might have to have a lock on it. Anyway, they are a little bit of a headache, and many of these swing gates tend to be left open. Nonetheless, we had one of these swing gates in our study design as a reference point where we have a physical structure with these electrified wires. Then on the lower left, these are bump gates. These are essentially fiberglass poles on a spring mechanism. You do not have to get out of your car. You can drive against the bump gates at low speed, and because they're springs and have rubber tips, and yes, they will make streaks along your vehicle. But if you have a farm vehicle, maybe that's okay. And it automatically closes behind you. There's vertical strands hanging from these fiberglass poles that are conductive and that carry an electric charge. Upper right, there's metal wires just a few inches above the ground. So these are drive-over wires. Now, if you have a sports car and a low muffler, this is not good. You would rip it all out, right? But again, if you have a farm truck or farm equipment with a higher clearance, it would be good. And we are hoping is that these black bears have such large feet that they cannot place them between those wires. They would be forced to step on them, and then they receive a shock. That same location was later changed to a drive-over mat, as is shown in the lower right. And these have alternating sections of metal grate that are positive and negative. So an animal would be shocked continuously as this animal walks across it. Now we had this attraction, right? And we had the bears that were used to eating melons. So in 2020, the harvest season was ongoing. Everything was operational, and we started to measure these black bears that would show up on the outside of these barriers. What percentage of them made it through individual barriers? Almost all of the designs were an absolute barrier or a near absolute barrier to black bears. That is great news. But the bump gates, the second column, as they came out of the box, because they're used in the livestock industry, they were not an effective barrier. Only about 50% of the bears that showed up in front of them would be repelled, and 50% would just enter the field through the bump gates. So what we thought about is a modification, and we attached a net to these bump gates with basically metal wire intertwined in nylon webbing. And I'll show you that in the next few images. Once we did that, it became an absolute barrier for black bears. And because we had such an attractant, we have pretty high sample sizes. You can see above the bars the number of bears that showed up in front of each barrier. And the greater the sample size, the more robust our estimate is of how much of a barrier it is. Even though these electrified bump gates with these electrified strands were not very effective in keeping the bears out, it doesn't mean that they don't deliver a shock. Here we have a black bear leaving the melon patch. It actually has a melon in its mouth. And the image on the lower left, you can see that melon in its mouth, but you can also see a strand on the nose of the animal. It's of course the most sensitive part of a bear. And the next image, lower left, you see the melon has been dropped and the bear jumps. Clearly, a shock has been delivered. But the issue is, when you look at the lower left here, is that these vertical strands allow a bear to stick its head through those wires and avoid the most sensitive areas to be in contact with the electricity. And yes, the flanks of the bear could be shocked, but there's a lot of fur there too. And some of them walk, others run through the vertical strands. And that is why we thought, well, if we force the bear to have more contact with the head and specifically the nose by attaching this netting that's on the right-hand side of this slide, maybe we are able to keep them out. And this was true. They didn't even interact with it. They just stood in front of it and did not go through it. Not one bear did so.
No jumping?
No, not with black bears.
I mean, like.
Yes, there was definitely a
climbing,
few.
Jumping.
There was definitely a few bears that actually put their front paws on the wooden posts that the bump gate is screwed into, but they would look and you could almost see them think, how do I cross this? But they did not climb, nor did they jump at the gates. They did have other means to access the melons, and I'll get to that in a moment. So once, basically all those access points were fixed and bears were not or barely coming in through those access points, the vehicle access points, we had increased evidence that they were digging under the fence. And you can see there's very creative maneuvers associated with that to avoid these electric shocks. But the attraction of melons is enormous, and they're willing to risk being shocked and have very elaborative maneuvers accessing the melon patch. Also on the way back, you see a black bear that has a melon at its right hind foot, and it goes back to the safe side, the habitat side of the fence, head first through the hole that has been dug under the fence, but it kicks the melon in such a way that the melon just rolls behind it, and he just picks it up on the other side. So one for the road. So then we directed our attention together with the NGO, people and carnivores, to fixing these weak points in the fence, various means through which we accomplish this. Now, when we had all these modifications to the vehicle access points and later to the fence, there's these distinct periods where everything is more or less the same. Then we make a change to either a vehicle access point or the fence. We have a new period with a new situation. And that is what you see in this graph. When you look at the first column on the left, it's a period between July and August 2020. And on the vertical axis, we see the number of intrusions by black bears into the melon patch. So where were they getting in? Access point number 4, that is the not modified bump gate with the vertical strands. And they were getting in at what we call fence west, a location where bears had been digging, and they would repeatedly use this one location to crawl underneath the wires. First modification was made, but no real change. They were still accessing these two locations. Then the bump gate was equipped with this netting. Now we have the third bar, and we basically see that the bump gate is no longer used as an access point. In response, though, there's increased use at the fence west location, and there's also a new location, fence middle. So basically what this illustrates is it is a system. And you have to not only think about individual points and make them a barrier, it is about the entirety of your system. This is true for a melon patch. It is also true for a road corridor fence. There cannot be any weak spots. If there are weak spots and if there's an attraction or a need to cross to the other side of the road or a desire to do so, then you'll have these intrusions and you'll have your risk to people and you'll have your dead animals. So we have to really evaluate a system and maybe go through a process where we monitor and modify, make adaptations until it actually meets our desired objectives, our goals. So eventually, by early September 2020, there were essentially no more weak spots, not with the vehicle access points, not with the fence. They were all addressed. And we see there actually were 2 intrusions, but they're so small in number of intrusions per day that they're not visible in this graph, right? So for all intents and purposes, black bears were almost completely excluded from accessing the melon patch for the remainder of the season in 2020 and throughout the season of 2021. Now, to illustrate this further about what happened, here is a graph that shows the total number of observations with the 7 cameras that we had at either the vehicle access points or at the 3 locations at the fence. And we basically counted all black bear observations inside or outside of the fence, regardless of the distance to the camera. And when we look at 2020, especially during the harvest season, August and September, and also October, maybe some rotting melons in the field, pretty high observations in the hundreds per month, right? So it was an insane attraction. Of course, there's many of the same individuals that come back and back again. It's not that we have 200 black bears, different individuals. We have a lot of repeat visits and in the hundreds per month. If you look at the dark bars, 2021, when we almost completely excluded the black bears, we see that the intrusions are extremely limited. So we have a 95% reduction in black bear observations at the melon patch, in or outside the fenced area, in 2021 compared to 2020. So that basically shows that we broke the addiction. Apparently, the bears learned we're not getting into the melon patch. We're not even going to show up on the edge because there's no use. It's just a waste of time, right? So it just shows you that when you stick with it, you are capable of breaking an addiction, even with a very strong attraction. However, you have to stick with it. And we'll talk more about that later, because 2021 was a different season. So what the farmer's perspective is this: in the first year, when we had still some issues with both the vehicle access point, the bump gate, and the fence, 80% reduction in melon loss. So the farmer was pretty happy. 2021, the farmer said, I really don't see any evidence of loss consistent with our observations of 2 intrusions over the entire season. However, this year, we retreated, the NGO had retreated, and it was up to the farmer to maintain it. And it was not good. And Sam was there on Sunday, and there were 2 black bears actively eating rotten melons in the field. And the farmer recognizes that and says, I had a ton of loss. We had a ton of black bear intrusions, and it's because I didn't keep up the fence, right? And even though this may be uncomfortable, I think this is also true for our transportation profession. We have the technology to address problems, but if we don't monitor its performance, if we do not repair, if we do not modify adaptive management, then we end up where we were before we implemented anything. It is not an easy message, it's not a comfortable message, but it's a hard truth. So this is what we are dealt with. And if we do not have the commitment on long term and the finances associated with it, you may ask yourself, do we want to do anything? Or should we accept that there are these negative effects? We are hitting animals. People are dying. People are getting injured. There's vehicle damage. There is a connectivity issue. But if we're unable or unwilling to maintain what we have, we know it can work. If we're unwilling to keep it up, then why are we doing it, right? Maybe some interesting conversation afterwards. Right. And I'll leave it at that. I want to thank all of you for financing this and having other types of contributions as well as the farmer, People and Carnivores, the NGO, and also Crosstech, who without any cost provided that drive over mat, and he didn't have to do that at all. It was completely free. Thank you.